The neighborhood had always carried a fragile tension beneath its spotless lawns and identical mailboxes, the kind of quiet pressure that accumulated slowly over years of mandatory rules, forced smiles, and the silent acceptance of an HOA board that operated more like a miniature regime than a community organization. For years, homeowners tolerated it all: the endless fines for harmless decorations, the strict schedules for when they could put their trash bins out, and the countless warnings about the strict color code that reduced creativity to a narrow list of approved shades of beige. In this neatly packaged world lived a homeowner named Daniel, a level-headed man who had moved to the neighborhood seeking peace, only to discover an entire ecosystem ruled by one woman, the notorious HOA Karen. Her influence spread across the community like a permanent shadow, and everyone knew that any small action she disapproved of, even slightly, would be met with letters, fines, and confrontations that could turn into public spectacle. But Daniel had managed to navigate it all for years, until the day he installed solar panels on his roof. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when the panels went up. The workers moved efficiently, securing each panel to the roof with quiet precision, while Daniel watched with the relieved satisfaction of someone finally taking control of his rising electricity bills. He had researched everything, verified every code, and ensured the installation met both state law and property guidelines. Renewable energy was not only legal, but actively promoted in the county. He felt confident. Yet, as the final panel locked into place, he sensed the shift in the air before he even saw her. Karen emerged from her pristine white house across the street like a storm cloud ready to erupt. Her arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes narrowed with the intense scrutiny of someone who believed she was personally chosen to guard the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Daniel didn't need words. The glare alone told him she had already decided the panels were unacceptable in her realm. By the time the installation crew left, the first email had already landed in his inbox, a message marked urgent HOA notice, demanding immediate removal of the solar panels due to visual disruption and non-compliance with the community's uniform design principles. Daniel read the email twice, confused, then irritated. He had done his homework. There were no explicit rules banning solar panels. The HOA's guidelines covered fence heights, mailbox designs, approved paint colors, lawn maintenance, garage door styles, but solar energy wasn't mentioned anywhere. They had simply never encountered it before, and instead of embracing progress, Karen reacted with knee-jerk hostility, treating it as an invasion. Within hours, the situation escalated. A printed notice appeared on Daniel's door, taped aggressively, as if the force behind the tape could communicate outrage. The notice ordered him to remove the panels within 7 days or face daily fines that would accumulate at an absurd rate. By sunset, neighbors began whispering. Some avoided looking at his house, afraid to be associated with conflict. Others offered subtle nods of sympathy, silently acknowledging the tyrannical nature of their HOA, but unwilling to challenge the board. Karen, meanwhile, walked through the neighborhood with a renewed sense of purpose, informing residents that Daniel's unsightly rooftop devices threatened property values. Her influence was strong, especially among those who feared falling into her line of fire. But what she hadn't anticipated was that many residents were far more supportive of solar energy than they let on. Quietly, privately, people had been researching panels themselves, but were too intimidated by the HOA's rigid control to take action. Daniel unknowingly became their test case, the first person brave or naive enough to try something new. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the notice beside him, illuminated by a small lamp as he tried to make sense of the madness. His frustration grew, heating inside him like a slow boil. He thought about the increasing utility bills, the environmental benefits, and the fact that his decision harmed no one. The panels were sleek, modern, and barely noticeable unless someone obsessed over them. And that someone, of course, was Karen. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, the panels glinted softly under the streetlights, a symbol of the freedom he thought he had when he bought his home. But now, they stood as the spark that would ignite a conflict far greater than a simple HOA dispute. He had anticipated resistance, but he hadn't expected a full campaign to strip him of the panels. When the second email arrived, this one threatening legal action, something changed in him. A quiet resolve settled in. He wasn't going to bow to an unreasonable demand pushed by a woman who thrived on control. Instead, he would push back. He would research laws, gather support, expose the inconsistencies in the HOA's approach, and remind the board and the neighborhood that homeowners still had rights. He could feel the weight of the battle approaching, looming like the gathering of storm clouds. But he also sensed something else beneath the tension, the faint rumble of support from others who were tired of the HOA's overreach. A rebellion was brewing, even if no one had spoken it aloud yet. The panels remained on his roof, shining like defiance. And with them came the first realization that he was no longer alone in wanting change. The neighborhood had been silent for too long, trapped under rules that suffocated creativity and personal freedom. Someone just needed to take the first step. Daniel had taken it, unknowingly. By morning, the conflict would begin to spread, and what started as a simple home improvement would become the opening chapter of a growing neighborhood revolt. And as he prepared for bed, knowing tensions would rise at sunrise, he had no idea yet how far this battle would go, or how deeply the community would transform because of it. The morning sun rose over the neighborhood with a deceptive calm, casting soft golden light across the neatly trimmed lawns and identical rooftops. Yet beneath that serene surface, tension pulsed like a warning current. Word had already spread overnight that Daniel had refused to comply with the HOA's notice, and by the time he stepped outside to collect his mail, several neighbors pretended to busy themselves just to watch his reaction. The HOA had escalated quickly. Rather than waiting the designated 7 days, they delivered a second printed notice, this time stamped with "Final Warning" in bold red ink that seemed intentionally meant to intimidate. It accused Daniel of violating the unwritten aesthetic bylaws, a phrase he had never encountered, and claimed that his panels were causing visual disharmony. As he read the document, he felt a surge of disbelief. The HOA wasn't even pretending to operate within reasonable boundaries anymore. This wasn't about community standards, it was about control. And the source of that control, as usual, was Karen. She strutted down the sidewalk later that morning, carrying a thick clipboard like a sheriff preparing for a raid. Her posture radiated victory, as if she believed she had already won the battle and was now making her rounds to bask in her authority. Neighbors shrank back as she approached, some offering tight smiles, others simply turning away to avoid confrontation. But a few watched with interest, eyes flicking between Karen and Daniel's house as if sensing that something larger was brewing. By midday, the HOA sent an email blast to all residents. The subject line, "Immediate Community Concern," set an ominous tone. The message detailed the so-called issue with Daniel's solar panels, framing them as a dangerous precedent that could spiral into architectural chaos. It urged residents to support the HOA in enforcing immediate removal, subtly shaming anyone who disagreed with phrases like, "Responsible homeowners will understand the importance of visual conformity." What the HOA didn't anticipate was how this very email became the spark that ignited silent frustrations across the community. Many residents who had quietly tolerated the HOA's behavior found themselves unsettled by the extreme language, the baseless accusations, and the implication that dissent equated to irresponsibility. For years, the HOA had wielded its authority without opposition, but now the overreach was blatantly obvious. Several residents whispered among themselves, first in driveways, then over fences, later through private group chats that had formed precisely to avoid HOA monitoring. Daniel, unaware of the growing conversation, spent the afternoon reviewing state laws. He discovered that not only were solar panels legal, but HOAs were prohibited from blocking energy-efficient upgrades unless they posed a legitimate safety risk or structural danger, neither of which applied. His frustration turned into determination as he gathered documents, bookmarked legal pages, and compiled a list of statutes that supported his case. For the first time, he felt the faint thrill of having leverage. But the HOA had no intention of backing down. Later that evening, they escalated the issue yet again by announcing an emergency board meeting, scheduled for the next day to address the violation and initiate corrective measures. The phrasing of the notice suggested they were prepared to take drastic action. Some neighbors received phone calls from Karen herself, pressuring them to attend the meeting and vote in favor of removing the panels. Her voice, cold and persuasive, carried the tone of someone incapable of considering the possibility that she could be wrong. However, beneath her surface confidence, cracks were beginning to show. A few residents pushed back, others avoided answering her calls, and the select handful reached out to Daniel privately. The first message arrived in the early evening, a short, cautious text from a neighbor he barely knew. The neighbor expressed support and admitted he had wanted solar panels himself, but feared the HOA's reaction. Then more messages followed. Some were from older residents tired of fines over trivial issues. Others were from young families who felt suffocated by the HOA's grip. One message came from a woman who had lived there for a decade and revealed she had once been fined for leaving her curtains partially open because it disrupted uniformity. As these messages poured in, Daniel realized that the neighborhood's irritation with the HOA had been brewing for years, hidden beneath polite interactions and forced compliance. The solar panel conflict was merely the final push people needed. Still, the HOA continued to flex its authority. Shortly before sunset, 2 board members drove slowly past Daniel's house, taking pictures of the panels from multiple angles as though building a case against him. Their expressions were a mixture of irritation and confusion, as if they couldn't grasp why someone would dare to challenge them. Karen, watching from across the street, wore a triumphant smile, assuming the photographic evidence would seal her victory. What she failed to notice were the other residents peering out from behind their curtains, watching the board's behavior with growing disgust. After hours of research, messages, and reflection, Daniel felt the clear shift in momentum. He realized the HOA wasn't just targeting him, they were revealing themselves. Their pettiness, their desperation, and their overreach were driving people away, rather than securing order. By the time night settled in, the air felt charged with unspoken energy. Conversations in hushed tones filled backyards. Lights remained on later than usual as neighbors discussed the upcoming emergency meeting. A once quiet neighborhood now pulsed with tension, outrage, and a new sense of unity. Something had changed, something irreversible. And as Daniel stood at his living room window, looking out at the dark silhouette of his home and the panels that had become symbols of resistance, he knew this wasn't just a personal fight anymore. Whether he wanted it or not, he was at the center of a growing storm, one that would drag the entire neighborhood into a conflict unlike anything they had seen before.
The next day arrived with a thick, unsettled tension hanging over the neighborhood like a storm waiting to break. Even before the emergency HOA meeting officially began, the signs of division were unmistakable. Neighbors who rarely interacted stood together in small clusters, whispering heatedly, their glances drifting between Daniel's house and the community clubhouse, where the meeting was set to take place. The usual atmosphere of forced politeness was gone. In its place lingered agitation, anticipation, and the faint tremor of change. As Daniel approached the clubhouse, he sensed a strange contrast. On one side stood the traditional loyalists, those who clung tightly to the HOA's authority, their stiff postures revealing unwavering allegiance to Karen and the board. On the other side stood those who had reached their limit, their expressions hardened with determination and quiet frustration, tired of years spent under rules that felt more like weapons than guidelines. The parking lot, normally half empty for routine meetings, overflowed with vehicles. Some residents walked from blocks away, drawn not by obligation, but by the desire to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Inside the clubhouse, the air was warm and heavy, buzzing with murmurs and impatient tapping. The HOA board sat at a long table in the front, arranged like a tribunal awaiting an offender. Papers were stacked high and the large binder of community bylaws lay open, though anyone who had lived here long enough knew the board often interpreted those rules however they pleased. Karen sat in the center, her face taut with authority and poised confidence. She held her clipboard with both hands, gripping it like a symbol of power, as though everything she said would be supported by the sacred notes she had gathered over the years. She barely acknowledged the residents filling the chairs, instead focusing her gaze on Daniel the moment he entered. It was a look of expectation, the look of someone certain that they were about to win. Once the room was full, the meeting began with an exaggerated display of formality. The HOA president cleared his throat repeatedly and tapped his pen against the table as though preparing for a speech of great importance. He began with a lengthy explanation of why the emergency meeting had been called, describing the solar panel installation as a serious disruption to neighborhood consistency and a challenge to the established aesthetic standards. His voice carried a rehearsed importance, but the words fell flat among the restless crowd. Several residents shifted in their seats, unimpressed. Others folded their arms, visibly skeptical. There was an unmistakable energy in the room, one that revealed not everyone believed the board's narrative. Karen then took the floor, her steps short and sharp as she stood to address the crowd. She launched into a detailed recounting of her concerns, describing the solar panels as harsh on the eyes, an assault on neighborhood harmony, and potentially dangerous, without offering a single piece of actual evidence. She insisted she had received numerous complaints, though the shifting glances around the room made it clear that those supposed complaints had never actually come from the people present. Her words were confident but hollow, filled with exaggerated implications meant to inspire fear rather than reason. And for the first time in years, the residents didn't appear afraid. When she finished, the president declared that the board was prepared to vote on immediate disciplinary action against Daniel unless significant justification could be provided to overturn their decision. The phrasing was meant to intimidate, implying Daniel would need an extraordinary argument to defend what should never have been in question. But instead of shrinking under the pressure, Daniel stood calmly, holding the stock of documents he had prepared the night before. He stepped forward with measured resolve, sensing every eye in the room shift toward him. He spoke evenly, outlining the state laws protecting homeowners' rights to install solar panels. He detailed the clauses that restricted HOAs from banning energy-efficient upgrades without legitimate safety concerns, none of which applied to his installation. He pointed out the absence of any rule in the community guidelines that prohibited solar panels. As he continued presenting, a quiet ripple spread through the audience. Heads nodded, expressions softened. People leaned forward in their seats, realizing what the board had done was not just unfair, it was unlawful. The HOA president's face tightened with discomfort. Karen gripped her clipboard harder, her knuckles whitening. For the first time in years, she appeared genuinely unsettled. When Daniel finished presenting his case, a long, charged silence fell over the room. The board exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for someone to challenge their authority with actual knowledge. And then, unexpectedly, a resident in the front row stood up. Without making a dramatic gesture or raising his voice, he calmly stated that he supported Daniel. He mentioned how he had always wanted solar panels but felt intimidated by the HOA's rigid enforcement. His confession cracked the room open. Another resident stood, then another, and soon a wave of voices expressed support, frustration, and a long-suppressed desire for change. People recounted petty fines, unreasonable warnings, and the general climate of fear that had defined the HOA for years. What began as a meeting about solar panels became a public reckoning. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, was now being dissected under the weight of collective resentment. Karen attempted to regain control, raising her voice and trying to dismiss the residents' concerns as irrelevant, but her commands were drowned out by the rising tide of defiance. For the first time, she wasn't leading the room, she was losing it. The board attempted to move forward with their vote regardless, but the residents weren't having it. Several demanded transparency and insisted the vote be delayed until legal counsel was consulted. Others called for a community-wide election to replace board members who abused their power. And then someone shouted what many were thinking, that if the board pushed this too far, the entire neighborhood would rally behind Daniel and challenge the HOA's authority all the way to court. That threat, backed by dozens of nodding, determined residents, finally broke the board's composure. The president stammered, flipping through his binder as though hoping a rule would appear to save him. Karen's confidence dissolved, replaced with visible fury, as she realized she no longer had the crowd under her control. After a chaotic round of heated exchanges, the board reluctantly announced that the vote would be postponed. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with an explosive rupture of trust and unity, leaving the residents energized and the board shaken. As the crowd dispersed into the warm evening air, one truth echoed through every whispered conversation. This neighborhood was no longer afraid, and Karen, for the first time in her reign, felt the ground shift beneath her.
The aftermath of the explosive emergency meeting spread through the neighborhood like a shockwave, rattling the foundations of the HOA's long-standing dominance and stirring a restless energy among residents who had, for years, remained silent under the weight of rigid rules and manipulated authority. When the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a community that no longer felt the same. Where once people avoided eye contact and moved quietly to prevent drawing Karen's attention, now small groups gathered in driveways, speaking in hushed but determined tones. The previous night had shaken something loose inside them. The fear that had kept them compliant had cracked. For the first time in recent memory, people felt an unexpected sense of unity, a shared recognition that they were all tired of living under a board that treated power like possession. Daniel, though still processing the intensity of the meeting, sensed the shift the moment he stepped outside. His neighbors, who previously offered only cautious nods, now approached with purpose. Some thanked him quietly for speaking up. Others shared long-hidden grievances, fines for grass length differences measured in inches, warnings for harmless seasonal decorations, and complaints filed against them for trivial issues blown out of proportion. One couple confessed they had tried to suggest minor changes to the HOA years ago, only to face subtle retaliation that made them retreat into silence. Story after story revealed a pattern of control that went far deeper than Daniel had realized. Karen and the board had shaped the neighborhood not through cooperation, but through intimidation, crafting a system where compliance equaled peace and dissent brought punishment. But now that system was cracking under the weight of exposure. As the early morning conversations grew louder, Karen watched from her window with a tightening jaw. For years, she had moved through the neighborhood with the confidence of someone whose authority was rarely questioned. But after last night's meeting, she could feel the weakening grip of her influence. The residents she expected to control were now rallying behind the man she had targeted. Even the few loyal supporters she still had seemed quieter, their trust shaken. She paced through her house, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline, drafting new strategies, new arguments, new tactics to regain control. But no amount of planning could undo the shift that had already taken root outside. Throughout the day, the neighborhood continued to buzz with activity. Groups gathered under the shade of trees, leaning against fence posts or sitting on porch steps, discussing not only Daniel's solar panels, but the larger question of the HOA's role in their lives. The idea of change, real change, began to spread. For years, residents had felt powerless, believing the HOA board was a fixed, immovable entity. But now many realized they had been mistaken. The HOA board existed because they allowed it to. It continued because no one pushed back. And suddenly, pushing back didn't seem so impossible anymore. That afternoon, a few neighbors approached Daniel with a bold proposition: forming a committee to challenge the board. Not just verbally, not just through complaints, but formally, legally, and structurally by organizing a petition for a community-wide election to replace board members who abused their authority. It was a suggestion that would have seemed unthinkable only days earlier. But after witnessing the arrogance of the emergency meeting and the blatant disregard for legal rights, people were ready to take action. At first, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't seeking leadership. He hadn't installed solar panels to trigger a rebellion. But as the group explained their frustrations and hopes, he realized the neighborhood needed someone willing to take on the burden of guiding the change. Not a hero, not a spokesperson, just someone who wouldn't back down when confronted by authority. He reluctantly agreed to help gather support, sensing that the movement had already begun, with or without him. As the day unfolded, more residents joined the effort. Quiet messages spread through neighborhood group chats, printed flyers appeared in mailboxes, slipped in discreetly to avoid immediate HOA retaliation. A petition began forming, each signature adding momentum to a cause that grew stronger with every passing hour. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration mounted. She attempted damage control by making door-to-door visits, insisting the HOA was simply protecting community standards.
But instead of the obedient acceptance she once enjoyed, she faced skepticism, irritation, and even polite dismissal. Some residents refused to open their doors at all. Her authority was slipping, and she knew it. By evening, the tension in the air had transformed into something powerful, something dangerous depending on where one stood. The once quiet streets now hummed with collective defiance. Porch lights flickered on across the community, illuminating clusters of neighbors united by the same thought. It was time for the HOA to answer for years of unchecked power. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table again, just as he had the night before the emergency meeting. But this time he wasn't alone. A handful of neighbors joined him, those who had been impacted most by the HOA's unreasonable enforcement. They spread out documents, reviewed bylaws, examined state protections, and drafted clear plans for the petition, the potential election, and the path to lawful reform. The meeting felt surreal. These were ordinary people. Teachers, retirees, parents, workers, yet they were finally stepping forward, ready to reshape the community that had long constrained them. And while Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, he also felt something else. A sense of hope that he hadn't felt since moving into the neighborhood. As the group dispersed into the cool night air, the neighborhood felt alive in a way that it hadn't in years. Porch conversations continued long after the stars appeared. Lights stayed on in houses where families discussed the changing tides and what the future might hold. And across the street, concealed behind tightly drawn curtains, Karen watched with growing dread. The neighborhood she once controlled was slipping away, and the movement gaining strength outside her windows threatened everything she had built. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back.
The momentum that surged through the neighborhood after the first week of organizing did not fade. Instead, it solidified into something heavier, more deliberate, as if every resident who had once remained quiet now sensed an unspoken permission to finally stand up. In the days that followed the gathering at Mark's driveway, the atmosphere shifted from whispers of frustration to genuine planning. And with each passing hour, the community began to realize the depth of power they actually held. But power, in a neighborhood tangled with an entrenched HOA board, was never something easily reclaimed. The board's silence over the petitions, the flyers, and the unified displays of support evolved from simple avoidance to a looming tension, the sort that made every morning feel like the hour before a storm touches ground. Mark woke each day with a heavier sense of purpose, fully aware that his fight was no longer just about the panels on his roof. It was about ownership, autonomy, and the larger principle that an HOA should serve the residents, not control them. As he walked through the neighborhood making his rounds, he felt a sense of responsibility settle over him, a recognition that many people were looking to him for leadership, even if they didn't explicitly say so. What surprised him even more was how many residents continued to come forward, each with their own stories of overstepping fines, unnecessary warnings, and moments when the board had made them feel small or powerless. Every confession became fuel, pushing him further into a role he never intended to occupy, but was now undeniably committed to fulfilling. The HOA board, meanwhile, began operating behind closed doors more aggressively, sending out coldly worded reminders about bylaws, compliance, and upholding standards that sounded more like threats than guidelines. Their emails landed in inboxes with a tone that only deepened resentment among the residents, reinforcing the belief that the board was preparing for a full-scale defensive maneuver. Even so, the board made no public acknowledgement of the uprising growing around them, choosing instead to rely on silence and the assumption that residents would eventually lose interest. They underestimated just how deeply the cracks in their authority had grown. One evening, Mark sat at the table with stacks of papers scattered around him, copies of signed petitions, drafts of proposed amendments, outlines for campaign messaging, and notes from residents who wanted to help. He realized that overthrowing an HOA board wasn't just about rallying people, it required navigating a maze of legal structure. With the help of a few neighbors who had experience with nonprofit boards, they unearthed the HOA's governing documents and began studying every clause, every procedural line that had once been buried in indifference. The bylaws outlined the process for calling a special election, signatures from 25% of the homeowners, proper notices sent to all residents, and a formal vote conducted with clear, documented transparency. Reaching that threshold once seemed unfathomable, but now, after the petition drive, the number was practically within reach. The more residents they spoke to, the more they realized the dissent had been simmering for years. No one had believed a change was possible before. Once they crossed the required minimum signatures, the shift in the community's collective confidence became unmistakable. It wasn't merely about removing the existing HOA board members, it was about reclaiming the right to decide what their neighborhood stood for. The phrase, "take back the HOA," spread through group chats, email threads, and late-night porch conversations until it became a mantra. As the push for a special election gained traction, the board's behavior became increasingly erratic. Karen, the loudest voice and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, patrolled the streets as though expecting to catch someone committing a violation. Her dissatisfaction seemed to swell every time she saw a yard sign supporting solar panels or a group of neighbors openly discussing reforms. She attempted to approach residents to dissuade them, warning that chaos would descend without the board's strict oversight. But fewer and fewer people listened. Her influence, once bolstered by the silent fear of repercussions, now seemed to dissolve under the weight of collective resistance. Even those who once agreed with her began distancing themselves, sensing that aligning with the community was safer than standing with a failing regime. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Mark worked tirelessly to maintain unity. He understood how movements like this could fracture under pressure, so he made a point to check in with different clusters of neighbors, families, retirees, new homeowners, ensuring they felt included and heard. What surprised him was how many residents offered help without being asked. Some created spreadsheets to track voting commitments, others drafted educational materials on solar energy, a few even volunteered to help newer residents understand how HOA governance worked. The neighborhood's transformation into a small, organized force was nothing short of remarkable. As word of the coming special election spread further, residents who had never spoken to one another were now meeting to discuss strategy, concerns, and hopes for what the community could be. Porch lights stayed on later at night as small groups gathered for planning sessions. It wasn't just rebellion, it was connection, something the neighborhood had been missing for years. But while unity fueled them, the board began deploying subtle tactics to slow the uprising. Rumors sprang up, claims that solar panels could reduce property values, whispers that the petition's signatures might be invalid, murmurs that Mark had personal motives for dismantling the board. None of it stuck, but the attempts showed how desperate the board had become. They also started sending violation letters more frequently, targeting residents who had participated openly in the movement. Lawn decorations suddenly became non-compliant, fences were too high, and garden plants were deemed unsuitable. It was a last-ditch effort to stir fear, but the attempt backfired. Instead of discouraging people, the harassment pushed more residents toward the movement. Mark knew that the board's fear-based strategy made the timing of the special election even more critical. With the required signatures secured, they submitted the official petition for the election, adhering to every bylaw requirement down to punctuation. The board received it with stony silence, their acknowledgement terse and unwilling. Yet even they understood that they had no choice but to proceed. The legal structure they had relied on to maintain their authority was now the very mechanism that allowed the neighborhood to challenge them. As the date for the special election was set, anticipation electrified the air. Residents who had previously remained skeptical began to show a glimmer of belief. Yard signs supporting the change appeared more frequently, creating a visual map of solidarity. Even homes that didn't display signs found subtle ways to show support: solar-themed window stickers, small symbols drawn in chalk on driveways, or porch lights switched to warm amber tones on specific nights as a quiet gesture of unity. The neighborhood, once subdued by conformity, was now alive with purpose. In the midst of all this, Mark reflected on how dramatically things had shifted since the day Karen had confronted him. A single argument over solar panels had become the catalyst for a neighborhood revolution. And yet, he couldn't ignore the exhaustion that trailed him. Leading a movement was heavy, but he kept pushing, driven by the belief that the outcome would reshape everything for the better. The night before the election, a sense of collective stillness wrapped around the neighborhood. Unlike the quiet that once indicated compliance, this silence was filled with anticipation. Families talked at dinner tables about what might change. Elderly residents sat on porches reflecting on how long they had wished for this moment. Younger residents whispered excitedly in cul-de-sacs as though preparing for an event larger than anything they had known. And at the center of it all, Mark prepared himself for whatever the next day would bring: victory, loss, or something in between. As he finally stepped outside for a late walk, the neighborhood felt suspended between what it had been and what it was about to be. Lights glowed in windows as people finalized their plans to vote. The breeze carried the faint rustle of yard signs, and somewhere in the distance, he spotted Karen pacing near her mailbox, tension radiating from her posture. She sensed what was coming too. The community was on the brink of a turning point, and every resident felt it deep in their bones. The next day would determine the future of the neighborhood, the fate of the board, and the meaning of the fight they had waged together. The storm was finally at the doorstep, ready to break, and the neighborhood waited for dawn.
The morning of the special election arrived with an unsettling stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavier than usual, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Long before the official voting hours began, residents were already awake, moving quietly through their morning routines with the awareness that this day was unlike any other. Even the sunlight seemed sharper, illuminating the streets with a clarity that revealed every crack, every lawn sign, and every hesitant glance exchanged between neighbors. The HOA clubhouse, normally a place of mundane board meetings and occasional community events, had been transformed into the epicenter of a battle for control. Signs pointing toward the voting area had been placed by volunteers in the early hours, ensuring no resident could claim confusion or obstruction. The board may have hoped to discourage turnout, but the neighborhood had grown too organized, too unified to allow anything to sabotage the moment they had fought to create. By the time Mark stepped outside, he could already see small clusters of residents gathering along sidewalks, their children tugging at their hands or riding bicycles in circles to burn off the nervous energy that mirrored their parents. There was no cheering, no loud celebration, only a quiet determination, the kind that often precedes monumental change. As he walked toward the clubhouse, every face he saw seemed to carry the same unspoken message: this is the day we take our power back. The closer he got, the more evident it became that turnout would be higher than anyone had predicted. Cars lined both sides of the street leading to the clubhouse, more than he had ever seen, even for holiday events. Some residents who lived within walking distance strolled with purpose, waving at others with polite but tense smiles. There was a sense of solidarity in their movements, though their expressions carried the nervousness of people who knew the outcome could reshape their future. When Mark arrived at the clubhouse doors, several volunteers greeted him, neighbors who had stepped up to ensure the voting process stayed fair, transparent, and compliant with the bylaws. They had studied the rules meticulously, determined to prevent the board from twisting procedures to their advantage. Inside, the room was already filling rapidly, the air buzzing with low conversations, rustling papers, and the occasional sharp tap of impatient footsteps. The HOA board sat behind a long table, their expressions strained as they attempted to appear composed. They wore the type of forced calm that revealed more fear than confidence. Karen, seated at the far right, held her posture stiff and rigid, her eyes darting across the crowd as though searching for any sign of wavering support. But the crowd wasn't looking at her, they were looking at one another, reinforcing their collective resolve with every silent nod. The process began slowly, as all official procedures tend to do, with the board reading through obligatory statements, many of which residents barely listened to. They had heard the board speak enough in recent weeks: lectures about aesthetics, threats of enforcement, veiled warnings about neighborhood decline, none of which held weight anymore. What mattered was the vote. When the sign-in process began, lines formed quickly, snaking out the door and along the sidewalk. Neighbors who had barely exchanged more than a wave in years now stood shoulder to shoulder, talking softly about their hopes for change, their frustrations from past board decisions, and the relief they felt at finally being part of something meaningful. It became clear that the movement had grown beyond solar panels. It had become a referendum on leadership, fairness, and the right to live without fear of arbitrary authority. As the hours progressed, turnout continued to surge. Retirees arrived with canes and folded chairs, refusing to be left out of a vote they had waited years to cast.
Young families pushed strollers through the crowd, balancing their children on their hips as they navigated the congested parking lot. Some residents who had moved away but still owned properties in the neighborhood even returned to cast absentee ballots, having kept close tabs on the situation through relatives or social media groups. The board's anxiety became increasingly obvious. One member repeatedly checked his watch, another tapped her pen with restless agitation, and a third avoided eye contact altogether. But Karen wasn't able to mask her frustration. She rose from her chair several times to speak with residents she recognized, attempting to sway them with her trademark blend of authority and insistence. But each time she returned to her seat with a tighter jaw, realizing that her influence had dwindled to almost nothing. The more she tried to regain control, the more obvious her loss of it became. Meanwhile, the volunteers overseeing the process maintained steady discipline. They ensured ballots were distributed fairly, that no duplicate votes were cast, and that records were kept meticulously. The transparency alone reassured residents, who remembered all too well how the board had frequently made decisions without consulting them. As the final hours of voting approached, the tension in the room grew thick enough to feel in the air. People lingered near the clubhouse even after casting their votes, unwilling to return home until the results were announced. It was as if leaving would surrender their place in history, a place they had earned through weeks of unity and determination. Mark found himself moving through the crowd, not as a leader addressing followers, but as a neighbor among neighbors, sharing sincere smiles, handshakes, and quiet acknowledgments of everything they had endured together. He didn't need to give speeches. His presence was enough, and the residents' confidence in him spoke louder than any words could. When the voting ended and the doors were closed behind the last participant, a hush fell over the space, as though someone had switched off the world outside. Volunteers began counting the ballots at a table separate from the board, following strict protocol and documenting each step. Residents watched intently but respectfully, unwilling to risk disqualification by hovering too closely. Even so, the atmosphere felt electric, the kind of silent hum that precedes a revelation. As volunteers tallied the votes, the board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the neighborhood had turned against them, but the scale of the turnout, far exceeding anything they had ever overseen, was a visible indicator of just how deeply they had misjudged their own community. The counting took time, and though the silence was punctuated by occasional whispers or the shifting of chairs, the collective tension only amplified the significance of each passing minute. When the final stack of ballots was counted and confirmed, the lead volunteer stepped forward with a sealed envelope, prepared to read the results aloud. The room felt as though it leaned in all at once, dozens of breaths held in a synchronized moment of expectation. The volunteer's voice was steady, but even she couldn't hide the emotion that colored her words. The results were decisive, overwhelming even. The motion to remove the sitting HOA board passed with a margin that left no room for dispute or denial. New candidates, including several who had worked closely with Mark, were elected to take their place, ushering in a new chapter of governance that prioritized fairness and community input. The reaction from the crowd was immediate, though not chaotic. There was no cheering, no wild celebration, only a quiet relief, a sense of liberation that washed over the room like a tide pulling back a long-buried weight. Some residents hugged, others clapped softly, and a few simply stood with their heads bowed, overwhelmed by the realization that they had finally reclaimed their neighborhood. The board members, on the other hand, looked stunned. One resident sat frozen, hands clasped tightly together, and another stared blankly at the table. And Karen, always so outwardly confident, seemed momentarily deflated, her expression flickering between disbelief and indignation. For the first time in years, she was confronted with a reality she couldn't control, a verdict she couldn't challenge, and a community that had openly rejected her authority. As she rose from her chair, her movements stiff and deliberate, she gathered her belongings with trembling hands. She looked around the room, perhaps searching for allies or sympathy, but found none. The power she had wielded so freely had evaporated in the span of a single vote. When she walked out of the clubhouse, her departure was quiet, almost unceremonious, a stark contrast to the disruption she had once caused in the neighborhood. After the board's exit, the newly elected member stepped forward, greeted with warm nods and genuine support. They promised transparency, cooperation, and a return to reasonable governance. But more importantly, they acknowledged the role the community had played in the transformation. This wasn't a victory for a few individuals, this was a victory for the entire neighborhood, a collective reclaiming of dignity and autonomy. As residents slowly dispersed, heading home with a renewed sense of ownership, Mark remained outside for a moment, taking in the scene. Children rode their bikes through the parking lot, couples walked home hand in hand, and retirees exchanged stories about what they hoped the next board meeting would bring. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long gold streaks across the pavement, illuminating faces that radiated relief and hope. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt alive, not with tension or fear, but with possibility. And as Mark finally turned toward his own home, he realized that the real work was only beginning. Removing the board had been the battle. Rebuilding the community would be the victory that truly mattered. But for now, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he allowed himself to breathe, deep, steady, and full of gratitude for the neighbors who had stood beside him. The rebellion had succeeded, the neighborhood had spoken, and the path forward had finally opened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky wide enough for the future they were ready to build.
The days that followed the removal of the old HOA board brought a strange calm to the neighborhood, a quietness that didn't feel like the oppressive silence of fear, but rather the exhausted exhale of a community that had just survived a long and bitter storm. For the first time in years, residents woke without the tension of wondering which arbitrary rule would be enforced next, or which complaint would appear mysteriously on their doorstep, or whether their landscaping choices would spark a conflict with a board that had long forgotten its purpose. Yet beneath the calm flowed a deeper undercurrent, a recognition that change, while long overdue, would not be simple, and healing the wounds left behind by years of hostility would take time, patience, and leadership rooted in fairness rather than control. The new HOA board held its first official meeting only days after the election, drawing the largest turnout the clubhouse had ever seen, even though there was no threat, no enforcement agenda, no punishment looming above them. Instead, the meeting felt almost ceremonial, the physical beginning of a new chapter marked by the presence of people who came simply to witness the dawn of something better. Mark sat among them, not at the front table, not elevated above the others, but in the audience where he chose to remain, not seeking a title, only wanting to ensure that what had been achieved would not be undone by complacency or miscommunication. From the moment the meeting began, it was clear that the tone of the neighborhood had shifted. The newly elected board members spoke with measured confidence, acknowledging the challenges ahead and the responsibility they carried. They outlined their first goals: rewriting outdated restrictions, creating committees so residents could participate directly in decisions, implementing transparent budgeting procedures, and most importantly, reviewing every enforcement action the previous board had issued to determine whether any fines needed to be overturned. When they announced that all pending citations from the old board were frozen until review, a ripple of relief spread across the room. People who had been silently carrying resentment, fear, and frustration suddenly felt lighter, as though the invisible chains that had tightened around them for years had finally snapped. Yet not everything settled so easily. The fallout from the previous board's collapse had left scars that could not heal overnight. Rumors circulated about how Karen was reacting in the privacy of her home. Some neighbors claimed they had seen her pacing in her driveway late at night. Others said she had vented loudly in the neighborhood Facebook group before deleting her posts. And a few claimed she had been seen arguing with contractors outside her house as if searching for a new outlet for control. But none of that mattered as much as the truth. The community no longer revolved around her. Her influence had evaporated the moment the vote was finalized, and the silence from her side of the street signaled not strategy, but isolation. Meanwhile, residents began stepping into roles they once avoided. People who had been afraid to speak out were now volunteering for committees. Neighbors who had barely interacted now collaborated on new proposals, eager to bring back a sense of unity that had been missing for so long. Even simple gestures, a wave across the driveway, shared tools, pooled resources for small repairs, became symbols of a shift in culture. But as the neighborhood worked toward rebuilding, Mark sensed an unfinished tension lingering just beneath the surface. For as much progress as they had made, there remained the question of accountability. What, if anything, should be done about the leaders who had abused their power for so long?
Some residents argued that letting the past go was the best path forward, that focusing on a brighter future was more important than pursuing punishment. Others believed that true healing required a reckoning, especially for the people who had been most harmed by unfair citations, harassment, or deliberate intimidation. The new board struggled with the issue, wanting to be fair but not vindictive, wanting justice but not revenge. Over the next week, they quietly began reviewing the old board's records, expecting to find a long list of minor violations exaggerated into unnecessary conflicts. What they discovered was far worse. The records revealed patterns of targeted enforcement. Certain households fined repeatedly for issues that others were allowed to ignore, letters marked as warnings that had never been mailed, and even notes scribbled in margins identifying families as problematic, defiant, or in need of monitoring. The board files, once thought to be dry documents of procedural enforcement, exposed years of manipulation hidden behind bureaucratic language. Some neighbors had suspected favoritism or personal grudges, but the documentation left no room for doubt. The previous board, led by Karen's iron influence, had transformed personal annoyance into official policy. When the new board shared these findings in a community update, the outrage was immediate and fierce. Residents who had once been hesitant to confront authority now felt emboldened, fueled by the undeniable evidence that they had been deliberately targeted. Even those who'd not personally suffered under the old system felt betrayed, realizing that the trust that they had placed in their leadership had been exploited. People demanded reforms, demanded acknowledgement, demanded reassurance that such abuses would never be allowed again. Yet even as emotions ran high, the new board stayed measured, emphasizing accountability without descending into the chaos of vengeance. They scheduled a formal grievance hearing, not to punish past board members, but to allow residents to voice what they had endured and to submit claims for official review so that fines, warnings, and enforcement actions could be addressed fairly. The hearing became one of the largest gatherings the neighborhood had ever seen. Stories poured out, some expected, some shocking. A couple described being fined for having a holiday wreath deemed too large. A family revealed they had been cited for improper shade tone of paint, despite using a color listed in the approved palette. One elderly resident explained how she had been given escalating fines for yard neglect when she had been recovering from surgery. With every story shared, gasps echoed across the room. People murmured in disbelief, and anger simmered like a rising flame. Yet the most disturbing revelations came from residents whose files had included personal comments, notes written by the old board that went far beyond policy. Words like "watch this one closely," "likes to challenge authority," and "habitual complainer" revealed a level of personal targeting that bordered on obsession. The hearing lasted hours, and by the end the atmosphere was heavy with a mixture of relief and lingering resentment. But something powerful had happened. The community had spoken, openly and without fear, and their voices carried a weight that could no longer be dismissed or overridden. In the following days, repairs began, both figurative and literal. The new board announced the cancellation of dozens of fines, refunding money where appropriate. They revised the bylaw structure, creating clear, enforceable, and fair standards, and they also introduced a new process for resident participation, regular town halls, open committees, and a public voting structure for any major changes. The neighborhood, once fractured and tense, began to feel whole again. But even as progress continued, a looming uncertainty remained. Karen. She had not attended a single meeting since the election, nor had she appeared at the grievance hearing. Her absence was both a relief and an unsettling reminder that unresolved tensions still hung over the neighborhood. Some believed she had accepted defeat and withdrawn. Others insisted she was plotting something, unwilling to let go of the power she once commanded. Rumors swirled daily, growing with each sighting of her curtains twitching or her car leaving the driveway at odd hours. Mark didn't care to engage in speculation, but he couldn't ignore the lingering sense that the story wasn't finished. Not with the way Karen had fought, not with the way she had clung to control, and certainly not with the fierce pride that had driven her every action. And his instinct proved correct. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast long orange shadows across the neighborhood, the new HOA board received a certified letter addressed to all members. It was from Karen. The moment the envelope was opened, a chill spread across the room. The letter was formal, meticulously written, and dripping with the kind of legalistic language designed to intimidate. In it, Karen announced her intent to challenge the validity of the election, claiming procedural errors, bias, and community manipulation. She accused the new board of conspiring against her, accused Mark of orchestrating a rebellion, and asserted that she would be pursuing legal action to restore the rightful governance of the neighborhood. The board members exchanged stunned glances, realizing immediately the threat embedded between the lines. Karen was not retreating. She was preparing for war. And with that letter, the calm that had settled over the neighborhood began to tremble once more, like a quiet before another storm. Mark, upon hearing the news, felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The battle they had fought, the one they believed they had won, was not over. The community had rebuilt itself with hope and unity, but Karen's challenge threatened to undermine everything they had worked for. The days ahead promised conflict, uncertainty, and confrontation that would test the neighborhood all over again. For though the old board was gone, its shadow had not yet disappeared. And as night fell across the neighborhood, porch lights flickered on one by one, illuminating homes where residents whispered anxiously about the future. And in the dim glow of her own porch light, Karen stood in her driveway, arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the neighborhood she no longer controlled. The war for the community's future was not finished. It was only changing shape. And in the distance, the winds of a new conflict began to stir.
In the days that followed Karen's legal threat, the neighborhood entered a tense and uneasy limbo, the air thick with anxiety, as residents waited to see whether her challenge would fizzle out like an empty threat or erupt into a legal battle capable of dragging the entire community backward into chaos. The unity they had painstakingly built now felt fragile, delicate as glass, and every passing hour seemed to stretch with uncertainty, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The new HOA board, though determined to protect the progress they had made, felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing on their shoulders. They spent long hours reviewing bylaws, studying election procedures, documenting each step taken during the transition, and consulting attorneys who specialized in HOA governance. They moved with deliberate caution because they knew that Karen's type of challenge, rooted in ego and fueled by stubbornness, had the potential to create months, if not years of turmoil, if not handled cleanly. Residents who had once celebrated the board's victory now found themselves gathered in small groups again, but this time their conversations were quieter, tinged with worry rather than enthusiasm. Rumors circulated that Karen had already hired an attorney, that she was gathering evidence, that she was calling past board members to her side. No one knew for certain, but the uncertainty alone was enough to revive the familiar tension the neighborhood had fought so hard to escape. As for Mark, he felt the shift more sharply than anyone. While he had not sought power or recognition, he had become the symbol of resistance, the unofficial leader of the uprising that pushed the old board out. Now he sensed the unspoken expectations of his neighbors, their silent hope that he would steady them through whatever storm Karen was preparing to unleash. Though he tried to remain calm, a quiet frustration grew inside him. He had fought the first battle to free the neighborhood, and now, when he wanted to return to normalcy, a life free from conflict, he found himself pulled again into the center of the storm. But even as he wrestled with his frustration, a deeper resolve began forming within him, a recognition that protecting the progress they had made meant standing firm one last time. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had weathered enough conflict to read its patterns, that Karen's challenge would not fade quietly. It would escalate. It would force a confrontation. It would demand a final reckoning. That reckoning arrived sooner than expected. 1 week after Karen's ominous letter, the new board received official notice that she had filed a formal appeal through the State HOA Oversight Committee, claiming procedural violations in the election process. The appeal triggered an immediate requirement for a hearing, one that would determine whether the election results were valid or whether the old board could be reinstated pending a new vote. The news hit the neighborhood like a sudden thunderclap. People who had once felt empowered began questioning everything. What if the committee sided with Karen? What if the old board returned? What if all their efforts vanished with a single ruling? The uncertainty cast a shadow over every home, resurfacing old fears and reopening wounds they had hoped were behind them. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later at a regional office miles from the neighborhood, a setting far removed from the streets where the conflict had unfolded, but no less significant in determining the future.
The board prepared meticulously, gathering documents, witness statements, and evidence of fair procedure. Residents volunteered written accounts of the election process, confirming transparency and appropriate protocol. Some even offered to attend the hearing in person as observers. Yet, even with all the preparation, the tension grew heavier with each passing day. Karen, meanwhile, maintained a low but calculating presence. She rarely left her house except for short trips that seemed timed to avoid running into other residents, and she communicated only through formal letters or online posts laced with accusations and veiled hostility. Her home, once adorned with decorations that asserted her dominance over neighborhood aesthetics, now looked strangely bare, as though she were conserving her energy for one final stand. When the day of the hearing arrived, a small caravan of residents drove to the regional office to stand behind the new board. They did so not out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to defend the freedom they had fought to reclaim. The hearing room was stark and sterile. White walls, fluorescent lights, a long table at the front for committee members, and rows of chairs for attendees. Karen sat on one side, stiff and unyielding, dressed in a way that attempted to convey authority, her papers stacked meticulously before her. The new board sat on the opposite side, calm but visibly exhausted, carrying thick folders of documentation. Mark sat among the supporters, his presence quiet but firm, knowing his role was not to speak this time, but simply to be there, an anchor for the community that had come to depend on him. The committee began by reviewing the procedural steps taken during the election. They examined sign-in sheets, ballots, volunteer logs, public notices, and documentation of compliance with state guidelines. As they moved through the evidence, their expressions remained neutral, but their careful attention made it clear that they were taking the matter seriously. When Karen presented her accusations, the tone in the room shifted. She spoke, or rather monologued at length about alleged manipulation, claiming the neighborhood had been coerced, that voters had been misled, that the transition had been orchestrated in a way that undermined proper governance. She framed herself as the victim of a conspiracy, insisting that her removal had been unjust and driven by personal vendettas rather than legitimate concerns. But when the committee questioned her about specific procedural violations, she could offer no concrete evidence. Her claims rested largely on interpretation, perception, and a belief that her authority had been unquestionable until others had unfairly intervened. Her argument leaned heavily on emotion and entitlement, lacking the factual grounding necessary to sway officials trained to recognize exaggeration. When the new board spoke, their approach was measured, factual, and supported by documentation. They detailed the transparency of the voting process, the reason for the special election, the overwhelming turnout, and the meticulous adherence to bylaws. Residents who attended were allowed to speak briefly as well, sharing concise accounts of the election process. Their statements were calm, respectful, and consistent with the board's documentation. The contrast between their steady testimony and Karen's increasingly agitated assertions was unmistakable. After hours of review, discussion, and questioning, the committee recessed to deliberate. The room emptied into a hallway where residents gathered in tight clusters, some pacing, others seated with folded hands. The air buzzed with anxiety, yet beneath it lay a quiet determination. No matter the outcome, they had stood together. For nearly an hour, tension hung heavy in the hallway. Finally, the committee returned. Everyone filed back into the room, breaths held, eyes fixed forward. The ruling was delivered in clear, unequivocal language. The committee unanimously upheld the election results. The process was valid, transparent, compliant with all requirements, and free from the procedural violations Karen had claimed. The new board would remain in place. Additionally, the committee recommended that the neighborhood consider implementing safeguards to prevent future board members from abusing authority, subtly acknowledging the dysfunction of the old leadership. The weight of the decision rippled through the room like a shockwave. The residents exhaled in collective relief, shoulders dropping, eyes closing, and hands clasping over their hearts. Months of tension dissolved in an instant, replaced by a warm, steady sense of victory. Not the electric thrill of rebellion, but the grounded assurance of justice finally served. But Karen, however, sat frozen. Her face drained of color, her composure shattered. For the first time, the impenetrable wall of her certainty cracked. She gathered her papers, with rigid, trembling movements, avoiding eye contact as she rose from her seat. She walked out of the room without looking back, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like the fading remnants of a rain that had finally ended. The neighborhood caravan returned home in a state of quiet triumph. There was no parade or celebration, only the simple satisfaction of knowing that the fight was truly over and that the shadow of the old board had finally lifted. Over the next weeks, the changes in the community became visible in small but meaningful ways. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now chatted across driveways. Families took walks without glancing nervously at their lawns. Kids played freely in front yards without parents worrying about fines. The new board began implementing reforms that reflected the community's values: clarity, fairness, involvement, and transparency. Committees flourished, new projects were planned, and for the first time in years, the HOA functioned not as an authority looming over residents, but as a structure supporting them. As for Karen, she retreated into her home, her presence reduced to a whisper across the neighborhood. She no longer patrolled the streets or reported imaginary violations. Her attempt to reclaim power had collapsed so thoroughly that even she seemed to recognize the futility of fighting further. In time, she prepared to sell her house, unable to remain in a place where her influence had evaporated and her reputation had been irreversibly diminished. One afternoon, as Mark watched a moving truck pull into Karen's driveway, he felt no sense of victory over her departure. She had been the catalyst for the neighborhood's transformation, albeit unwillingly. Her aggression had forged their unity, her control had sparked their rebellion, and her downfall had allowed them to rebuild. When the truck doors closed and the last of her belongings were carried away, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer, and finally complete. As the sun dipped below the rooftops that evening, golden lights spilling across lawns now free of threats and fines, the community gathered at the park for a modest, impromptu celebration. People brought food, shared stories, and laughed without reservation. Kids played freely in front yards without parents worrying about fines. Neighbors toasted to a future shaped by cooperation rather than coercion, and the air hummed with the quiet joy of a community reborn. Standing among them, Mark felt the tension of the past months fade fully for the first time. The journey had been exhausting, messy, and fraught with conflict, but the neighborhood had emerged stronger, united not by fear, but by shared purpose. And as he watched families enjoying the warm night air, saw friendships rekindled, and listened to the soft symphony of voices rising around him, he knew that the